This week on Notes from America, meet a climate scientist who happens to be an evangelical, how her faith and work intersect. Plus, actor Omar Epps on his new novel, which imagines a world that did not address the climate crisis in time. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Listener supported. WNYC Studios.
Longtime New York Times journalist and New York One host Sam Roberts loves at least two things: New York City and history. His latest book focuses on people who made tremendous contributions to New York City's history but have largely been forgotten. Titled The New Yorkers, 31 Remarkable People, 400 Years, and the Untold Biography of the World's Greatest City, it tells the story of 31 New Yorkers who lived through different eras of the city's history. As Roberts writes in his intro, you'll meet the first woman to appear nude in a motion picture, who also became the face of Civic Fame in Manhattan, the couple whose affair ended the Gilded Age, and the husband and wife who invented celebrity talk shows, the victim of the city's first recorded murder in the 17th century, and the high school dropout who slashed crime rates in the 20th. The woman who won her racial discrimination case against a bus company a century before Rosa Parks, and the mobster, the mayor banished by fiat from 5 boroughs. The man who refused to accept the familiar nostrum, you can't fight City Hall, and the family who fought Trinity Church for 4 centuries in a dispute about property now worth billions of dollars. And you'll meet the father of Greater New York. With me now to talk about his book is Sam Roberts. By the way, the book is being released tomorrow, and for the occasion, Sam Roberts will be at the Museum of the City of New York Tuesday night for a book event at 6:30, but he joins us now. Welcome back, Sam.
Allison, thanks so much for having me.
So what were you looking for in a person for them to be included in your book?
Well, I had written a couple of books about New York history, looking at material culture, history in 101 objects and 27 buildings, looking at Grand Central Terminal. And what I wanted to do was a biography of New York City. So I wanted to do look at people who were kind of overlooked by history. We all know some of the famous people, and I was looking for people who were more quirky, people who were not well known, but people who in their own way were kind of transformative in New York history. So I did lots of research, went through lots of background, old newspapers, old books, and found people who were just mentioned in passing and came up with an arbitrary number of 31 out of what I found was a universe of somewhere like 1 billion people who had ever lived in New York in the past 400 or more years, and came up with these people who were just remarkable in their own way.
When you were doing the research, did it become clear to you about why someone is remembered in history and why someone isn't, even if they made a big contribution?
Well, it's very interesting. Thomas Carlyle said that history is really the biography of great men, of course, great women as well. But, how do you define greatness? He said, is a great man someone who brought the armies over the Alps, or is a great man some poor slob who invented the spade? The fact is, it's a little bit of both. And what I was looking for were the ones who were kind of unheralded, the people who you would not read about in ordinary history books and guidebooks, the people who we would not know about. About the only one in the book who we would know about, who most people would recognize, is John Jay, former governor of New York, former Supreme Court justice. And he is in the book for something that most New Yorkers, most people wouldn't know about at all. And that is that he brought the United States Capitol to New York City. And the way he did it was sort of a bizarre thing. He was the only congressman in American history who hijacked the selection of the New York Capitol. They wanted him to be Secretary of State, and he said, I'll only be Secretary of State if you move the American Capitol to New York City. And what that did, it was such a profound thing to New York City's history, was after 7 years of brutal British occupation during the American Revolution, it helped resurrect the city after that, and really brought the city back after the revolution. So it was crucial to the city's revitalization.
My guest is Sam Roberts. The name of his new book is The New Yorkers, 31 Remarkable People, 400 Years, and the Untold Biography of the World's Greatest City. Let's dive in with someone whose work we feel each and every day as you're walking around New York City. You call him the geek who invented gridlock, John Randall Jr. He created the map of what we now know as the grid system.
That's right. It was fascinating when you think that North Street in New York City in 1811 was what is now Houston Street. It gives you an idea of how far the city went, that the back of City Hall was faced in brownstone because people thought nobody would look at the back. Everyone was below that level of City Hall. Everyone was farther downtown. And what the city street commissioners did was try to rationalize the future development of Manhattan. So through John Randall Jr., they decided to map the rest of Manhattan. And what they did was map it all the way up to what became 155th Street, which was enormously pressured. The idea was to rationalize development in an egalitarian kind of way. Now, he developed, in effect, gridlock because he rationalized it in terms of making all these rectangular blocks all the way uptown. A lot of people thought that created a matrix that was all too uniform. Rem Koolhaas said that it created a pattern that was, kind of a crazy quilt. But what it did was allow for the development of Manhattan. John Jacob Astor said, in retrospect, that if he had to do it all over again, he would have bought every square mile of Manhattan. He did pretty well even not doing that, but obviously would have made a lot more money had he done that. And it made for the development of Manhattan as we know it today.
What still remains from some of those original plots and plans of Randall, and what is something that's completely different?
Well, what's completely different are things like Rockefeller Center, Grand Central Terminal, obviously Central Park intruded in the middle of that, thank goodness, and things like Madison Square. But it's amazing how much of that original grid plan that the street commissioners voted in 1811 is still in existence. And if you look very carefully, what they did was lay out the streets in terms of markers, concrete markers at the intersections, and iron bolts where they could not put markers, where there were granite boulders in the middle of the intersections. If you look in Central Park in the 70s, on the east side, you can still find one bolt that is left there where they intended to put an intersection. That is sort of the last remaining marker of all of those intersections that John Randall and his street commissioners laid out in the 18 teens that were left of the street commissioner's plan.
Let's talk about a teacher named Elizabeth Jennings, born in 1827 in New York to two Black parents. She was refused entry to a trolley car and she resisted. What happened?
Oh, Allison, that is one of my favorite people in the New Yorker's book. This Elizabeth Jennings was a teacher. On a Sunday morning, she was late on her way to play the organ at a Lower East Side Baptist church. And she boarded a trolley downtown on Park Row, and the trolley conductor threw her off the trolley because the trolley was for whites only. And she said, no, wait a minute, I have a right to be on it. I'm a respectable Black woman. I'm nicely dressed. And he threw her off the trolley and she sued. And her lawyer turned out to be a young lawyer recently admitted to the bar named Chester Arthur, who would later become the president of the United States. And she won in Supreme Court in Brooklyn. And this was 100 years before Rosa Parks. And nobody remembered her, totally forgotten, totally overlooked by history, until, in fact, a group of students in an elementary school on the Lower East Side remembered her and got a street intersection renamed after her. And this Elizabeth Jennings made history, set a precedent for saying that any respectable woman or a passenger who is nicely dressed, respects the law, has a right to mass transit, no matter what their race, no matter what their religion, no matter what their ethnicity. And this was in 1854, and she set that precedent, and it lasted for decades and 100 years again. And, it just bothered me that everyone had forgotten her, even, Black historians. And I thought she deserved that kind of recognition, that she was overlooked.
My guest is Sam Roberts. The name of the book is The New Yorkers, 31 Remarkable People, 400 Years, and the Untold Biography of the World's Greatest City. I want to ask you about another woman who was intimately involved in the early 20th century labor disputes among the city's garment workers. She was an immigrant from Western Ukraine, barely 5 feet tall, Clara Lemich. I'm not quite sure how to say the last name.
Lemlich is right.
What was interesting to you about her story, and what lasting contribution did she make?
Well, she made an enormous contribution. She was one of those people, totally unknown. She was one of the Jewish and mostly Italian garment workers who was totally overlooked by the male unionists in the Ladies Garment Workers Union. And they were all holding a rally protesting the fact that wages were low, that they were totally mistreated by the shop owners. And they were listening to speeches down at Cooper Union, hours of speeches saying, they were protesting conditions. And Clara Lemlich got up, and in Yiddish, which many of the people could not understand, but they understood her passion, understood her emotions. And she said, I want to say a few words. And her few words passionately ignited this crowd. And she said, we need to go on strike right now. And what she started was a strike of 20,000 garment workers. They went out for 3.5 months in the middle of the winter, defied the male union bosses, and won the strike. They sort of won a battle more than the war, but the strike reduced the work week to 52 hours. Doesn't sound like a great victory in retrospect, but it was at the time, and set a pattern of union victories in that garment workers union that lasted till today. And she became a real fighter for union victories. She didn't fare that well herself because she was blacklisted by the shopkeepers, but she went on and became a force in unions. She retired to California in a nursing home where she organized the workers there into her 80s and became a real figure in labor history. And Frances Perkins, who became labor secretary under FDR, said that the labor movement and, in effect, the New Deal began with strikes like that led by Clara Lemlich. And what followed a couple of years later was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, just a couple of blocks away from that. And that was really the impetus for the New Deal. The labor legislation that came out of that in New York State triggered what became the labor legislation of the New Deal. And it all happened here in New York, and it happened by little people, if you will, like Clara Lemlich, who were kind of forgotten. And we forget that it was unknown people like that who were so important to history. They are the great people of history, and I thought they deserved the kind of recognition that a biography of the city could afford them. I thought they really ought to get that kind of merit in a book like The New Yorkers.
It's also inspiring because sometimes we think, what little thing am I doing? Will it make a difference? Should I get involved with some sort of civic action? Should I get involved with my city? And the answer is yes when you hear a story like Clara Lemlich.
Allison, you're absolutely right. And, we think, well, what can I do? How does my vote count? What difference am I going to make? And what I found in this book, in one way or another, was how much of a difference people can make. They may not make a difference even in their own time. They may not get the kind of recognition they deserve in their own time. They may not get their own recognition in history. And I tried to rectify that as much as I could to make history more interesting for students, for adults, and show what an impact individual people could have.
It wouldn't be a New York story if there weren't a real estate kerfuffle. This one happened to last over 3 centuries. It's an area about the entire size of Greenwich Village. What was the central issue in the case of the Annika Jans Bogardus farm?
Well, a fascinating story. You think of Charles Dickens' Bleak House as being a long running dispute. Bleak House was sort of a small claims court dispute compared to the Annika Jans Bogardus case. This was a woman who inherited or was granted 62 acres on the Lower West Side, farmland at the time, of course. 4 or 5 of her 6 heirs sold the land to various people, and one heir did not, was not a party to the sale. And this case by her heirs went on for more than 200 years. No, 400 years. I'm sorry. It went on till at least 1931 from 1662. And just a fascinating case, and was carried on by dozens and dozens of people, people who were defrauded by lawyers. And of course, that land is worth billions and billions of dollars now. It contains part of Greenwich Village, Lower Chelsea, property that is worth untold billions of dollars. And the adjudication went on for centuries in terms of who really owned it, whether it was the Crown, whether it was Trinity Church, and a fascinating case that was fought in the courts of New York and went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. So real estate obviously is the bedrock of New York from the very time that Peter Minuit thought he was buying Manhattan for what amounted to $24.
Preston Wilcox is another person written about in the book, great-grandson of slaves who moved to Harlem as a young adult. And he really took on how New York City schools were failing students of color. What did he do?
Another person I had never heard of, Preston Wilcox, who was the godfather, if you will, of community control and school decentralization. And what was so fascinating about him, a figure who was in the background to a great extent of the IS 201, the 1968 school decentralization dispute, what he was doing, as Diane Ravitch and other educational historians pointed out, was exactly the same thing that Cardinal Hughes, the Archbishop of New York in the early 1800s, was doing in terms of Catholic parochial education. He was saying, we want Catholics to be educated by themselves, not part of the Protestant school system in New York. And he said, Blacks should be educated by Blacks. We wanted not necessarily segregation, but separateness. And that's exactly what the Cardinal was saying in the early 19th century. And people thought this was radical, school segregation. And in fact, when you go back and look at it in historical context, it was the same thing that the Catholics were talking about 150 years before. And it was looked upon as a radical anti-integration platform, when in fact, in many ways, it was anything but that. And I tried to put that in a historical context as well.
For someone who's thinking, I feel like this is their wheelhouse, they're a big New York City history nerd, after they read your book, where would you suggest they could go for just a great afternoon of researching New York? New York Historical Society, the library? Where would you point somebody who just wants to get their history nerd on?
Well, one of the problems, Allison, is that this history is, for the most part, not told. And that's what I found so interesting in researching the book, that when you look at ordinary histories of the city, they leave a lot of this stuff out. They leave it out in terms of people. They leave it out in terms of the anecdotes. They leave it out in terms of the incidents and the people who did things that were transformative, like the 31 people in this book. They can go to the Museum of the City of New York tomorrow night, Tuesday night, and hear me talk about it more. And I hope they read this book to find that history can be told in much more fascinating ways.
The name of the book is The New Yorkers, 31 Remarkable People, 400 Years, and the Untold Biography of the World's Greatest City. It is by Sam Roberts. As Sam mentioned, he will be at the Museum of the City of New York for a book event tomorrow. The book comes out tomorrow. The event is at 6:30 p.m. Sam, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Allison.